Behind every rising empire and every collapsing state and every conflict, there is an invisible force called statecraft. But what really statecraft is? Is it just a simple military strategy or diplomacy? Or is it the hidden architecture that determines whether nations survive or vanish? From Athens to Washington and from Mughal Empire to Pakistan and India, statecraft has made and unmade civilization. Today, in an era of realignments, great power rivalries, undermining of the multilateralism and nuclear non-proliferation norms, understanding statecraft is not only for the military generals and diplomats, it is for everyone who wants to understand the political chessboard around us. Hello, this is Moiz Khan and welcome to the Statecraft Anatomy, the podcast where we will explore the hidden codes of the strategy, diplomacy, governance that shape the destinies of the nations. In today's inaugural episode of the podcast, we will look at the very anatomy of the statecraft, what it means, and how it has been understood across history, and why it still matters for the survival of the states. So, to deal with these difficult questions, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Ilhan Niaz, a leading historian, professor, and an author of several books whose work explores the governance, power, and politics across centuries. Together, we will explore the statecraft in theory, in history, and in today's complex world order. Assalamu alaikum, sir. Good evening and welcome to the very first episode of the Statecraft Anatomy. And this is a very honor for me that you are here with me, sir.
Hey, thank you for inviting me on.
Professor, for our listeners, let's start at the very foundation. For many, the word statecraft sounds very abstract and vast. Could you tell me what exactly statecraft means? And what are its core elements?
So very simply, statecraft involves making decisions about how to use the power and resources of a state. And it relates to the use of those resources and that power, both in relation to the internal conditions of that state and in the context of the relations of that state and other entities that might exist in the international order of a particular time. So that's essentially what statecraft is all about. And within it, there are different dimensions of a state's power, a state's influence, everything from ideology to its economic wealth, to its industrial and scientific potential, to its military power. All of that are different elements of statecraft that someone that is engaged in its practice has to comprehend and balance in the pursuit of goals that they deem to be desirable. So that effectively encompasses the meaning of statecraft and what are the different dimensions of it. I think the first thing that any state has to comprehend is what are the total resources that are available to it, both for the pursuit of its internal objectives and for the conduct of relations with other states or other entities that might exist. So that is perhaps the most important thing. And this is a very difficult thing because it is very easy to arrive at an incorrect estimate of what your actual strength is. And you might overestimate it, you might underestimate it. On balance, it is safer to underestimate than overestimate. So it's a really difficult task for anyone that is engaged in it to do very well. And states are historically making mistakes. They keep developing really bad path dependencies. So while the practice of statecraft is something which is widespread in history, the ability to do a good job of it is relatively rare. So when we look at the actual conduct of states, we find a lot of bad examples and a relatively smaller sample of good examples. So statecraft also involves trying to learn from both these sets of examples and make better decisions.
Thank you, Professor. You have provided a very comprehensive definition of the statecraft, but when we look into history, we see that thinkers including Machiavelli, Kautilya, Clausewitz, and Ibn Khaldun, they shaped how rulers understand power, seize power, and utilize the power. Could you please walk us through those key ideas and theories and tell us that how they define the statecraft and its elements?
Okay, so obviously, when we look at different thinkers from different time frames, we might see that they don't necessarily agree on what is a desirable objective of the statecraft that they are advocating. So, if you look at an ancient thinker or a classical thinker or a modern thinker, there might be certain very important differences. But what all of these thinkers would have in common is the idea that the state that they represent is worth preserving, and the interests of that state, however defined, are worth pursuing. And then they will elaborate on what are the different ways in which you can go about defining and pursuing the interests of whatever community or state they happen to represent. When we think about individual theorists, I would argue that probably Ibn Khaldun gives us by far the most comprehensive understanding of what is a state in relation to everything from geography and environment and demography to the actual conduct of its leaders, its political system, its social system, its political economy, and how those states actually become strong or then become weak. And in order to explain this, what Ibn Khaldun uses is a very key concept, which sort of sums all the other factors together. And that is the level of group solidarity that exists within a state. So one of the most important things which Ibn Khaldun teaches us is that it is the willingness to sacrifice, the willingness to take risks, the willingness to give combat if necessary, the willingness to die if necessary for a particular state that gives that state a tremendous amount of strength. So, of course, everything else is very important. You need resources, you need territory, you need technology, you need science, you need crafts, you need all sorts of things. But ultimately, it is this feeling of group solidarity that motivates people to actually risk combat, to risk themselves for the sake of something that is greater than themselves. So for Ibn Khaldun, this is something that is absolutely vital when you are looking at the relative power of a state, which is why, as he explains, history is full of surprises. such as, for example, the Arab defeat of the Persian and the Byzantine Empire, leading to the establishment of the first Islamic empire. Even though the Arabs had fewer resources, fewer numbers, a lot less wealth than the Persians or the Byzantines, they were able to defeat them. And they were able to defeat them, as Ibn Khaldun explains, because of their superior asbiya, or their superior group feeling, that allowed them to prevail over materially superior adversaries. Now, this does not mean that the material dimension of statecraft is unimportant, but for Ibn Khaldun, it is the will to use it and the will to sacrifice in using it that is absolutely key. And, we can take this idea and you can apply it to a wide range of contexts, including the modern Middle East, where you have all these really rich Arab countries with huge defense budgets that are completely helpless in the face of Israeli aggression. And the Israelis, with a far smaller population and far smaller resources, are basically able to establish their military dominance over the entire Arab world. So that is the point which basically Ibn Khaldun is getting at, that yes, a lot of things are important, but what basically synergizes all these things is this group solidarity, is this group feeling. So the greater the group feeling, the more intense it is, the more convincing it is to those who feel it, the more likely a state is to gain a large amount of influence. And conversely, a state can have a lot of other things going for it. It can have a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of territory, but it can still suffer defeats and reversals if it lacks for group feeling. So I think there is one theory in particular that is highly instructive, because it very effectively gives us a sense of both the material and non-material aspects of state power. And so while it is easy enough to assess the material dimension of state power, it is a lot harder to assess the non-material dimension. And so Ibn Khaldun gives us an analytical framework through which we can actually assess that very key aspect.
Thank you, Dr. Niaz. You have discussed the ideas of Ibn Khaldun in very detail, and now I'm really interested that how would you differentiate amongst ideas of Ibn Khaldun with that of Machiavelli and Kautilya, as we know that their thinking still influences the foreign policies of the West and India respectively. So please tell us about the core differences amongst their theories.
Okay, so I think that Kautilya fundamentally has a materialistic view of the power of the state, and he also has an amoral view of the power of the state. So in that sense, you can think of him as a realist as far as his understanding of the state is concerned, even as far as the internal condition of the state is concerned, and also when one state has to deal with other states or other polities that are in contestation with it. Machiavelli, of course, is a more diverse thinker, because the one work that he wrote that became really popular is The Prince. But The Prince is actually a very small part of his total work. And in The Prince, which he wrote in order to try and get his old job back when the regime changed in his hometown, he articulates a very amoral, hard-nosed, materialistic view, cynical view, you might even say, of the state, which is fair enough. But when you look at his study of the Roman Republic, particularly his book, The Discourses, in which he looks at the rise of the Roman Republic, what he identifies as a key factor in the rise of any state is what he calls the sense of virtue or the sense of public spiritedness and competitiveness for glory amongst its citizens. And he argues that what made the Roman Republic such a powerhouse was because its political institutions channeled the competitive impulse of its people in such a way that they ended up struggling to achieve greater glory in order to be remembered by the rest of their community. So, uh, in that case, you might say that his idea is a little bit closer to Ibn Khaldun, in which he is also looking at the non material dimension of state power and essentially how a state can motivate people to do things that advance its interests or advance its cause. So I think this is also something to bear in mind. If you've only studied The Prince, you might walk away with a somewhat imbalanced view of Machiavelli.
Yes, interestingly. But now, if we discuss our contemporary world and we shed light on the evolving geopolitical and security landscape, where we see US China strategic rivalry, Russia's assertiveness, Trump's impulsive decisions, the decline of multilateralism, and the rule based order, whether it existed or not. So, how do you see the practice of statecraft in the changing global order?
Well, I think if you try and understand world order, it's always useful to understand the world system that exists at any point in time as a reflection of the global balance of power at any given point in time. So when we think about the post 45 period or the pre 45 period, or if we go further back into history, essentially what we see is that whatever type of interregional or international order exists, it reflects the underlying balance of power. But within the balance of power, there is also a very important element of whether or not the leadership of particular states decide to try and exercise their power in a particular way. So it isn't as if the international system miraculously changes from dominance by one group of countries to dominance by another group of countries simply because the economic or the industrial balance has shifted. There is actually a fight that takes place. And this fight is very fundamental to the way in which international relations and the world system is organized. So within world systems, what we see is that there are essentially three types of fights that occur. There is the all-out military conflict between great powers, such as that we saw during the first half of the 20th century. There is a version of Cold War that might exist in which you have great powers contesting against each other, but trying to avoid a direct military clash with each other, but still trying to undermine each other through other ways. And then you might end up for brief periods of time under a condition of hegemony in which one group or one element is able to establish a strong position and gains the upper hand. And while it has the upper hand, it can police and configure the world to suit its interests. But then gradually it loses its standing and other powers start to emerge. And then you go into either a Cold War phase or a hot war phase, depending upon how the emerging power decides to readjust the international system to better accommodate itself. So I think that's a good way to basically look at this problem. And, you can apply it to the world today as well. When people talk about, the rise of China or the turbulence in the Middle East or the return of Russia to its historical expansionism, or even to our own part of the world where you have a nuclear standoff between India and Pakistan. So you can use this to try and assess how the world is evolving.
Yes, exactly, Professor. You have raised very significant points. Now, if we talk about the relevance of statecraft in the contemporary world, and as you mentioned, the various changes and transformations that are taking place, do you see that the idea of very statecraft has evolved, or do you see it the same as it has remained traditionally?
Well, I think that if you think about the rules-based order, to begin with, I don't think you can really undermine the rules-based order, because to undermine something, it has to exist in the first place. And the rules-based order never really existed for most of the world. And at best, it reflected a kind of consensus between maybe a few dozen very rich countries around the Atlantic about what are the things that they think are best suited to normalize their hegemony over the world system so that there is less violent resistance to it. So that is, of course, now in a bit of trouble because of the resurgence of American unilateralism, because of various internal problems in Europe, and because of the return of Russia to its historically expansionist trajectory and the war in the Ukraine. So that has sort of, brought the pressure on this very rapidly to the front. But it never, really existed for most of the world. It was simply a question of either American hegemony or during the Cold War trying to play the Soviets and Americans off against each other. So that's all it really amounted to. I think it's also important that when you look at emerging techniques or emerging technologies, such as cyber warfare or AI, then the method that states use, of course, evolves. So, there was a time when empires fought with bows and arrows, and then there was a time when they fought with gunpowder. And then there was a time when they fought with aircraft and tanks and machine guns. And today, they don't just fight with the military equipment, but it is also the integration of that military equipment into a digital chain, which actually makes some armies very effective and other armies less effective. So I think that this evolution of the techniques of warfare or the techniques of contesting with each other, this is something that is driven by the simple fact that those who are in a strong position under an existing order want to preserve that position, and those who are on the losing end of that equation naturally want to change their status. So equilibrium is elusive. It is something which is really not there. It's basically continuously being renewed or continuously being challenged or otherwise being undermined. So in that competitive disequilibrium, you have a sort of, arms race where everyone is trying to develop capabilities that disrupt the strengths of the adversary. So you have, horizontal proliferation, you have vertical escalation, you have all sorts of different things that countries can employ. So I think this is something important that we need to bear in mind, that the techniques evolve, but the purpose for which those techniques are being employed, those remain remarkably constant.
Yes, very true, Dr. Niaz. But I want to take a pause and I want to raise the question again that the things that you have mentioned, I want to know that what are the inevitable elements of the statecraft that a state needs to master in order to survive in the anarchic world?
Okay, so I think one of the big problems that we have today is that the basic assumption of statecraft in the past was that we live in a world that is ecologically stable. So, whenever you think about thinkers from earlier periods, they imagined that the natural order of the world would more or less continue as it has, and that human modification of nature, though it might be significant, would not lead to the collapse of the underlying ecosystem. What we are now seeing, of course, is that our ecosystem is collapsing. That between climate change in terms of global warming, between the ecological crisis in terms of the loss of the world's biodiversity, and then, of course, you have a lot of localized impacts that affect individual countries or individual cities. You really face this situation where states are really no longer the principal threats to each other. The principal threat to the survival of any state today is the changing climate. It is global warming. But the problem is that state elites throughout the world are still conditioned to think of the interests of their state in the old way, where the world was still ecologically stable. So, just to give you an example of this, during the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the United States spent something in the range of 7 to 8 trillion US dollars in fighting against terrorism, which included the invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, but also other operations in other parts of the world. And during the same period of time, the United States spent about 150 billion US dollars on combating climate change, a tiny fraction of what it spent fighting against terrorism. But as any scientist will tell you, terrorism, while a serious challenge for many societies, does not pose and did not pose a life-threatening level of threat to the United States. But climate change very clearly does. And today you actually have a government in the United States that not only is not willing to do anything about climate change, but which also denies that climate change is a serious problem and is trying to pressurize international organizations and bodies to effectively defund programs intended to try and address climate change. So, so this is, I think, a very, very important thing that we often fail to realize, that statecraft often involves dealing with threats from other states. So most of our thinking about statecraft deals with this kind of a problem: a military threat, an economic threat, a social threat, an ideological threat, whatever type of threat that another society, or maybe a serious internal problem that somebody else is exacerbating, poses to you. But climate change is basically such a all-encompassing threat. It is such a terrible threat that its magnitude simply dwarfs all the other problems that states think that they have. But state bureaucracies and state militaries and state political elites and economic elites are still conditioned to thinking about their problems, assuming this ecological stability. But that ecological stability is really no longer there. And you see this happening very clearly. So, for example, if we talk about a state like Pakistan, Pakistan is basically the gift of the Indus. It is built around the Indus River system. At present, what we're seeing is that the type of flooding that we used to see happen maybe once every 50 to 100 years is now happening every third or fourth year. And as global warming intensifies, this might become an annual occurrence.
Yeah.
So the question is that if you are a Pakistani policymaker and you are thinking about threats to Pakistan, yes, of course, India is a very serious threat to Pakistan. Yes, TTP is a very serious threat to Pakistan. Yes, different insurgent and terrorist groups that are operating within Pakistan against the state are a serious threat to it. Yes, there are a lot of other very serious threats to Pakistan. But this threat is something which dwarfs these other problems. Now, because states are still conditioned to think of threats in the classical military political sense of the term, they also fail to cooperate with each other when it comes to dealing with these threats. So we saw this happen with the flooding in India and Pakistan, where you had very similar scenes on both sides of the border. And clearly, if India and Pakistan want to continue fighting each other, they have every right to do so. But in order for them to continue fighting each other, they need to be living on an inhabitable planet. So, if you want to keep fighting each other, that's perfectly fine. But given that climate change poses an existential risk to India and an existential risk to Pakistan, and of course the other South Asian states as well, and we are all extremely vulnerable to its medium and short-term impacts, we have to work out a way to deal with it together. But the classical thinking that is hardwired into the elites that sit in Islamabad and in New Delhi is not interested in thinking about their problems in this sense. So I think this is a big challenge that we face, that as we head into what we might call the geopolitics of climate apocalypse, all of our traditional notions of what a state is and how diplomacy ought to be conducted and what type of pressures you have to face and how to apply pressure to others, all of that becomes meaningless on a planet that is 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now, because the ecology collapses. So, this is a point that I often make when I talk to friends from America or China, that, look, if you guys want to have another Cold War, go ahead, no one's going to stop you. But before you do that, do try and understand that if we keep behaving the way we are behaving, by the end of this century, there'll be no world for anybody left to dominate. So, there are no geopolitics on Mars because nothing can live there. In a similar manner, there will be no geopolitics on Earth in another 100 years because nothing will be able to live here either. So I think this is a very, very serious problem, that all of our thinking about these problems belongs to an era of ecological stability. And as we head into an era of ecological chaos and instability, these ideas essentially are distractions from what is actually a threat to the continuity of not just individual states, but the entirety of human civilization.
Thank you, Professor. You have put it in a very brilliant manner for our listeners. But as you mentioned about the failing of the statecraft, I'm interested that what happens when states get this meaning of the statecraft wrong? And could you please share some of the examples where statecraft led to the collapse and the failure of the whole governance system?
I think what leads to a lot of mistakes and a lot of bad decisions throughout history is the tendency of people in power, people who make decisions, to overestimate their ability to control the world around them. And having overestimated that ability to then make decisions that are based upon a very optimistic assessment of their state's potential or their state's capability. So, just to give you a few examples of this, when we think about the First World War, one of the things which made the First World War far more likely was the fact that all of the great powers were convinced that they would be able to win the next war quickly, decisively, and cheaply, and that the new methods of warfare at their disposal would ensure a swift and comprehensive outcome that would work out to their advantage. And this is something which was generally shared, whether it was the Germans or the Russians or the French or even the British. The expectation was that, well, if there is a clash, we're going to win. And yes, sure, there were different ideas on how long it would take to win. The Germans were planning for 6-7 weeks. The British were a bit more cautious. They thought it would take at least till Christmas. But at the end of the day, what happens is that they all get locked into this bloody open-ended war of attrition. So that's one very powerful example because of the fact that everybody thought that, well, we're going to win and we're going to win quickly. So I think this is something which is very often a source of instability. A very good recent example of this is the Indian Operation Sindoor, in which the government of India basically decided that it is going to try and treat Pakistan the way that Israel treats its Arab neighbors. And the Indians grossly overestimated their ability to pull this off. And they underestimated the Pakistani resourcefulness and ingenuity. And the result was not just a tactical reversal for the Indians, but a significant degradation in their hard power stock all over the world. So I think it's important that, when we think about these different examples, whether it's, something big like the First World War or something relatively small like Operation Sindoor or anything that falls in between, this false sense of superiority or this false sense of confidence built upon a mistaken assessment of one's own potential and a failure to actually assess what the adversary is capable of doing is something which then causes a lot of problems and a lot of errors. So a wise leader, a good statesman, someone who is an effective practitioner of statecraft, will always underestimate what they can do and overestimate what their adversary can do. But what we see throughout history time and time again is that leaders and regimes do the opposite of this. They overestimate what they are capable of doing and they underestimate or are dismissive of what their opponents are likely to do. And I think this is a very important element, a very fundamental weakness in thinking about statecraft, regardless of what period we are looking at.
Thank you, Professor. And this brings us to the final segment of our podcast, where I will ask you Thank you, Professor. This brings us to our last segment of the podcast, where I will ask you some rapid fire questions, and I expect that you will give very clear and sharp questions and very short to 2 to 3 questions. So, my first question is: you see statecraft embedded in realpolitik, idealist paradigm, or constructivist paradigm?
I'd be inclined to simply seeing state relations through the lens of power dynamics. So that would put me, I suppose, in the realist camp of the equation.
All right. My second question is that which books would you recommend to our leaders on the statecraft?
Well, it's very optimistic to recommend any books for the leaders of Pakistan to read. But I think there are a couple that everyone should take a look at. There is a wonderful history of world order by a Turkish historian. Her name is Ayşe Zarakol, and the book is called Before the West. So that is something that is really worth reading. There's another remarkable work. This is by an American scholar. His name is Charles Hill. And the book is called Grand Strategies. So it's sort of like an intellectual history of what is a grand strategy and how this concept has evolved. And of course, you should go to the classics and study them for yourself as well. So we've referred to various thinkers like Kautilya, for example, or Ibn Khaldun. Their works should also be read. And I would add to that list Nizamul Mulk, Tusi Siyasatnama as well.
Thank you, Professor. And my next question is, what are those biggest threats into which a nation statecraft may fail or may not be able to achieve its goal?
I think what you perhaps mean is that what is the reason for bad statecraft?
Yeah.
So I would say that the basic reason behind statecraft is the tendency of ruling elites to have a lot of hubris and a lot of false conceit about themselves and their ability to insulate themselves from reality. So that is actually the cause of a lot of the bad statecraft.
Very interesting, Professor. And my last question is that if you may share one piece of advice to our aspiring diplomats.
As one of our old Foreign Service officers, Ambassador Altaf Sheikh, used to say, by way of advising younger diplomats, the less said, the better. So that's what I would advise as well. That try to keep your remarks as brief as possible and listen more than you talk.
Right. So with this, I thank you very much, sir, for joining me. And it's a true pleasure and honor that you joined me on the very first episode of the Statecraft Anatomy. Sir, I will be bothering you again with the coming episodes and that. And in the coming episodes, we will narrow down the topics and we will discuss with very focused elements into that. So
Thank you, sir.
I really hope that you will join me, you will have time and you will join me again, sir.
Looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.